I have never taught this class the same way twice, and what that means is that there is experimentation going on in all ways, including the assignments. So I'm not sure that this will work, but I will pitch it to you nonetheless. Okay. So here's a picture of the bench. That is my new friend Nick, who is one of the big shots at the Long Now Foundation, one of the tenants of Fort Mason. So in that smaller picture, you can see there's a building behind him. There are these huge sheds that go out on these piers into the bay. This is a real place. That's a sketch that Christopher Alexander made when he was thinking about the bench. Nothing that anybody ever built anything off of, just something he did for himself. And there's the view. There's this funny ottoman thing, and it looks, the view is screwed up majorly by these ugly aluminum railings today. And beyond these railings, you can see Alcatraz is in the foreground there, and then the Marin headlands beyond there. It's a really beautiful view. Changes all the time on the basis of weather. It's a really nifty spot. And so I was thinking about giving you all this Zen view pattern from the pattern language book, and then having you invent another pattern or discover one. But you've not been to this place, and I think it's really all about this place. And so I have instead given each of your groups 3 groups per pattern. And focusing on these, I believe that this is true about this place. That the pattern called Sleeping in Public, and these are hyperlinks to, there's a website where all of the patterns from this book are recreated on the web, so you don't have to buy anything. You can read your pattern from the website. But, oh, I don't want to do that, do I? Okay. And so the way that I'm thinking about this is groups 1, 2, and 3 are dealing with this pattern called Sleeping in Public. And I believe that the other patterns are covalent in the bench place at the same time. Zen view is going on there. Intimacy gradient is something that it needs more of, I think, but it's definitely something there. And then the most speculative one here is holy ground. Certainly for me, when I go visit here, this is a real pattern. This is something real that's going on in the environment. And in order to explore a broader domain where I had been thinking about AR exclusively with this, on the basis of how different these patterns are and archetypes of use, I have you in alternating bands of thinking in terms of augmented reality, which would be a overlay device of some sort that is used in a physical place, like where the bench is. And the pink bands are virtual reality, which would be headset in a remote location, but all of the action is situated in the virtual equivalent of Fort Mason and the bench area. This middle column here represents the archetypical use that each of your groups will grapple with. So group 1 is dealing with the archetypal use of homeless who are ongoingly in this place. And I know that this is true because I've sat with them, I've seen evidence of their habitation here. And you're going to use, and this is why we're in the university, children, so we can play, that AR would help this person with this problem of sleeping in public. So that's your scenario, is an ongoing use of this place in physicality. So it's an AR app, and group 1 will address the homeless. Group 2 will address that sleeping in public pattern on the basis of Fort Mason tenants, like my friend Nick. He works at the Long Now Foundation. If this thing worked, he could go take a nap on the bench, and that'd be awesome if you helped him with augmented reality. And then the group 3, and that's a repeat use, because Nick, once he can put on this AR rig and it shuts off all the stuff that makes it so you don't want to sleep in public, and he successfully learns to sleep in public, he would do that on a repeat basis, presumably. And then the last group on the sleeping in public pattern, group 3, this is a first time ever visit scenario. and it's for an area resident. There's houses across the street from Fort Mason, say it's a resident on their first visit, and this app is going to foster their ability to either understand other people sleeping in public or, my gosh, attain what the pattern says. This is like a really high attainment. And think about it, when's the last time you saw somebody sleeping in public? Usually it's somebody sleeping rough on cardboard, and it's not a good situation. This is the opposite of that, on this beautiful bench, being able to enjoy a nap. So that's the first group on the sleeping in public pattern. These patterns there's 230 some of them in the book. When they have 1 star next to them, it means that there is a high degree of certainty by the researchers. There's a list of participants who did this research in Mexicali, Mexico, somewhere in Peru, places on the west coast of the US. All of these patterns are deeply researched on the basis of what people do in space and what's good for people. ZenView is a single star pattern, so that's saying they feel really confident that what they've talked about with the pattern, sort of reusable way of thinking about the problem and the solution in the pattern. They think this is a pretty solid one, 1 asterisk. Intimacy gradient, the next one below, has 2 asterisks. So that's like a super confidence indicator. And then sleeping in public and holy ground, not enough research to get any sort of a asterisk. So group 4, again, here's the pattern. It's ongoing use, and it's VR, and the use case scenario is Park Service staff. They are in the Presidio. They aren't physically present at Fort Mason. They've got it rented out mostly to tenants and stuff. So something to help them use a virtual visit to the bench to govern and administer the park better. Group 5, and on the basis of this ZenView pattern. Group 5, also on that pattern, it has a repeat usage scenario in virtual reality, and it's architecture students. Perhaps like yourselves, or think of a friend up at the Taubman School that they would go a couple of times to this virtual world of the bench in Fort Mason because of reasons that you will figure out. And then group 6, first time use scenario. This is the tourist who wants to go in virtual space before they go physically. Let's say they're in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and they're planning a trip to Fort Mason, and this is one of the things they're considering, and they're using the amazing technology of virtual reality to go there. What does a first-time visitor need in terms of this ZenView pattern and in terms of information in that space? Next 3 groups, 7, 8, and 9, are working on intimacy gradient. And group 7 has the ongoingly scenario, again, of the homeless. And this is in coordination with, what'll be fun is when we're done to see how intercompatible or not the solutions you come up with are. Like the ongoing use case in AR, could we have whatever you come up with intimacy gradient be part of the same app as what the team does on the sleeping in public one? We'll see. So that's a homeless population ongoingly using the place, and we need to increase the gradient, the sense of privacy. Repeat usage is Fort Mason tenants. Again, think of somebody like my friend Nick, works at the Long Now Foundation. How will you make a augmented thing for him? And then the first case usage here with the intimacy gradient is tourists. So there might be some interesting comparisons between this first time VR tourist who is planning and the AR experience that another team builds for the first time a tourist shows up in meet space. And then the last group is addressing this pattern called holy ground. The use case here, there isn't an ongoing use case for this one. So I changed that to an accidental first. And I've been this guy. And for the VR teams, I will bring in my rig if you want to go to the Microsoft's Cliff House, which is the starting point for going into VR experiences that are compatible with Microsoft technologies. And I sometimes find apps in there and start using them. I ended up in a piazza in Italy on a travel app, and I didn't know what I was doing or what it could do or why I would care. So that's that use case is me, basically. The repeat VR visitor is architecture students again. And then the on-purpose first-time user, a tourist planning. So intentional overlap between what groups are doing and trying to spread this out across these different kinds of space. Does that start to make a little bit of sense? Okay, I'll say more then. So this is how I think it works. You've been assigned a pattern, an archetypal user, and a modality. ZenView for tourists on their first visit using VR. So I think the first thing to do is to generate and rank something that is really helpful in the UX consulting world right now. It's a rising method, which is talking about users' jobs to be done. And another way of saying that is, if the user was hiring your product or service to do something for them, what are they hiring you to do for them? And if you, usage being tantamount to an act of being hired. So in each of these scenarios, what is the homeless person who implausibly has this AR rig that can be on them as much as they'd like? What are they hiring this app to do for them? And my suspicion is it will be different for that archetypal user of the homeless than for the Fort Mason tenant, than for the area resident. And that's the first thing. As you meet in your groups today, it's let's read this pattern together and what the hell does this mean? And then starting to generate and rank what are the jobs to be done and putting them in rank order. And it's not an endless amount of what are all the things that a homeless resident of Fort Mason wants. It's in the service of this pattern that we're working on. What's the thing doing aspect of that for real people? So we can do that today, generating and rank the jobs to be done on the basis of your user and your pattern and your modality. Next week, we'll have a guest lecture and also time to work in groups. And next week, the next move, I believe, as I've got it described here, is to develop a conceptual model to solve for your pattern or your jobs to be done. And I have two different kinds that I have in mind. If you want to invent one, that's fine. But the primary one is what kinds of information to situate in what kinds of space. So I'm a park service staff putting on the VR thing to check in on how much trash and illegal activity is going on down at the bench. What is the model for what kind of information is where in space? And I imagine this could be a really dumb diagram. It could even be a table in Microsoft Word of the kinds of information that are always to the left are these things. The kind of information that's always to the right are these things. When I look down, there's this kind of information. When I look up, there's this kind of information. A conceptual model of what kind of information to put in what space in addressing your jobs to be done and your pattern. The other way that you could do this, and some of you may have the methods for this from other courses you've done or other work you've done in UX, is a scenario journey map type thing. Give me a scenario of a user's journey from getting out of the car at Fort Mason to walking up and doing their first time sitting on that bench and looking around. Talk about that journey. And that will be a model, and that'll be great. And then on the basis of that model, after the model solves for the pattern and solves for these jobs that your user needs to do, then the next piece is to develop a snapshot. So in the diagram about the conceptual model about what kinds of information to go in space, you could do a mock-up of if it's the Park Service guy checking in on VR, the moment he sees something illegal happening, a mock-up of what that looks like. And there are all kinds of things in the world. There's a link here to a methodology for using a grid and downloads of this kind of graph paper that lets you simulate, project onto a 2D surface what the up, down, left, right world of VR looks like. There's a professor here at the University of Michigan who has come up with a really great way. This is contextualized as AR. I don't know why you couldn't also do this for VR, which is make a little Play-Doh model of the bench and 1 second of a moment of use, and then hold up in front of it what is the overlay, and then using photography to create paper mock-ups. I really don't care what the mock-up is, other than this first thing is a concept model that talks about the whole way you want to think about solving for your pattern and for your user. And then pairing that with a mock-up from 1 second of use. And if you don't know how to draw, congrats, neither do I. These models can be as dumb as you like. But what we're checking on is that this is a poster session, that at the end when we're done, so here's a wireframe of one way to do a poster, that I would come up with a height and width for these based on what we can get printed. There's some question. I'm certainly not going to ask you to pay a printer to do fancy printouts. I'm going to try to find a modality that we can get printed, and we're going to try to get a room with pin boards. And so when we do our final presentations of this, it'll be 12 poster boards and sort of a cycling around of everybody looking at everybody's work. And what we'll get is, what is the pattern you were working on? What were the jobs to be done that you were solving for? How did you rationalize a model, either of the user's journey or of what kinds of information to put in what kinds of space? And then give us a 1 second screenshot from a moment of use of this. And that's it. And we would learn from all that comparison. Yes?
Clarification question. So is it pattern doing the 4 topics?
Yes.
Not like the graphical power for pattern.
No. Like sleeping in public. I can imagine somebody doing a task flow of where, if I was sleeping in public, it would be, where's my wallet and keys? Where am I going to go pee? What are the sounds? What direction should I be facing? Like there's, and the patterns should help you when you read them. They talk about generally the problem of sleeping in public and generally how you start to solve it. I imagine some of these mock-ups might suggest superimposing more than just information in space. Since this is a book about architecture and it's all predicated in terms of a physical environment, and because these AR, VR systems do allow us to put polygons into space in ways where they stick to the ground in the right way and they solve for the parallax distortions and stuff, you can believably put objects in space. Some of your solutions might include not just where to put information in space, but you might want to suggest putting other things in space to help whatever kind of a user you're trying to help address whatever kind of a pattern you have.
Second question is, the situation is only restricted to the Fort Mason bench.
Yes.
That area.
Yep. I mean, last week when I was imagining this, it's still, and I should probably write a little brief about this. I should probably add a narrative to this, but the generic sense is, think of the Park Service as the client. Think about this as a pilot program that is focused on the bench. And if you solve for these patterns at that bench really well, you'll get all the points. But my sense is, if you were to take some time to think about the next larger context of how does this work in the rest of Fort Mason, and or like the Holy Ground people, has anybody here been to Cathedral Grove in the Marin Woods north of, that's a Park Service administered place. That is holy ground to many of us. I would want to at least do sort of scenarioizing to think how good or not good. And you could even talk about that in your poster is, we feel like we've solved for the immediate context, but when we think about a broader context, we're not confident that this would work. I don't know, but some way of thinking about this as a real prototype for a real piece of software that the Parks Service wants, and it's piloted at Fort Mason. What else did I have here? I think that might be it. Oh, yeah. So has all the parts is half of the points. Just did you do all of the things? The next set of the evaluation criteria: agreement between the jobs to be done and the conceptual model. So if the jobs to be done that you pull for somebody who works in Fort Mason are X, Y, and Z, then I'm going to want to see how you deal with that in the conceptual model or in the user journey, that they're talking to each other. And then similarly, agreement of the conceptual model and the mock-up. The mock-up is meant to be a snapshot of 1 second or nanosecond of use. And you could pick, if you're doing a user journey, you could pick the third step on a user journey. Your mock-up might not have the bench in it at all. If you're doing getting from the car to the bench, and that's leaving the car and getting oriented toward the bench is step 1 on your journey, or step 2. You could do your mock-up as, here is a 1 split second view from I just got out of the car, and it's saying, I don't know. I have only curiosity about what these end states might look like. Yes?
Another question. Let's say 4 hours, it is the forest VR for the Zoom video. Is it something that I say in Alpha right now, VR, to see what's that scenario, that Zoom view in Fort Mason bench, or I have to go there and then put on a VR set and then.
My assumption was that all of the VR scenarios are remote, that you are not closing off. And that's an interesting thing, right? AR, to the extent that it can partially rewrite your environment, there is a line, and if any of you want to blur that line, feel free. If you're on the AR side, AR can become VR if you completely take over the visual field. And if you want to maximize the Zen view, the story, it's very famous. Some of you may have heard it, that one of the most admired tea houses in all of, I think it's probably China, is a tea house that is facing the ocean, and the wall facing the ocean is completely opaque, except for an opening just above where the tea bowl sits on a table that's facing the ocean. And it's saying through that setup of space that when you possess that tea bowl, when you behold it, it is the whole ocean. So you don't need the whole view. You just need that little rectangle behind the bowl. And so some of you who are dealing with Zen View might be asking the question, do we want to get rid of we could use AR to get rid of those ugly fucking aluminum railings. We could also use AR or VR to change, we could put up walls around this bench. If we're solving for sleeping in public, we might need to put some structures up. So some of you might be walling off the view of the ocean and then choosing a different way to present it in VR or AR. But I don't think it's true. I don't think there's a use case for VR where VR becomes AR. That would be like using the VR rig on site. So if you're in an AR group, you have the liberty to get almost all the way into VR land, but VR people, you are remote, so you don't have as much liberty, I would say. It's pretty weird. But I think the evaluation criteria, I always try to do this in a way where this is not striving to get grades. This is, if we proceed stepwise and try this and humor it, we should be able to get all of the points. So we'll go stepwise through this. Today we'll work on the jobs to be done, and I'll visit each group if you like. Next week, we will talk about the conceptual models, and we can look at journey maps together, other kinds of modeling. And there should be time in each of the classes leading up to the presentation class to work on this together. And again, the big question mark, which I hope to have more certainty around next week, is the poster size and how to get that produced in a way where you are not spending a single dollar on that. I might try to get a sponsor from a print shop because I want the poster session to be fun. Has anybody else made posters for work for SI? How did the printing thing work? They've got plotter printers there?
They charge like $30 or something, which my student did not have things like that. So it covers most of it. It gives you
$30 for, and what were the dimensions?
36 by 48.
I'd pay for that for your work. Then I get to keep the posters. Yes.
You always ask for their staff to help you, because pretty much you can't do that. Like a lot of settings and stuff.
Yeah. That's the dodgiest part of this, I realize, but I also don't want to do the PowerPoint style end of class group presentation. I would rather have the ability for lots of your group members to talk with people about what you did and why. Okay, well, why don't we take a break and come back when the big hand is on the 8. So let's give ourselves a luxurious 15-minute break, and then get together with your groups and start reading your pattern. And I will come visit you and help assuage whatever trepidations you have.
Oh, yeah.